realise the extent of the programme until last night. I think it's a fantastic initiative. We have a phrase in England, jack of all trades, meaning you can do most things, but master of none, and that's how I regard myself. But certainly housing has been a theme in my life since I first became an undergraduate student and ever since. You've seen my jacket. I suggest you might need sunglasses. I'm going to take it off. Okay, I'm down to the technology. What I'm proposing to do is to talk for some time, not too long, about the sorts of things that I believe that we, most of us, all of us, but older practitioners, researchers and teachers, might want to urge new entrants to the professions related to housing to take into account. It's something which I constantly reflect on as I have a bit more time these days. And then I'll talk about just a couple of projects, because I'm always in danger of talking forever, although somebody who should be named has said that it's perfectly okay to be next to an office through house. I'm not going to do that. I'll come back, I think, in a second to Noel's house in Willows, and the alternative, which is Corbusier's machine for living. And this is Carlisle. Carlisle was a cartoon which I think fits the bill very well. And if your German's even worse than mine, the caption reads, Edgar, how did this vase come into our ego? She doesn't mention flowers. This comes from Michael Thompson, who's the man who wrote Rubbish Theory. And he used to, for many years, ask students to write essays on a variety of different subjects. But one of those subjects was compare Noel's house and Willows with Corbusier's machine for living. And it produced apparently an interesting range of tensions. The best one, I think, was that one such distillation of architectural angst reached this conclusion. Though Noel's house appears very attractive from a purely human point of view, I feel that as an architect I must side with Corbusier. And Thompson points out that in struggling with this problem, he cut architects off and himself from the rest of the human race. And I mean, I think it is an issue that I found particularly in relation to housing, particularly in relation to housing where you're actually working with communities who are extraordinarily expert in housing, but often not recognised by professionals. Now, I like this diagram, which is by Corbusier, although he took it from a book called An Outline of the Theory of Practice, if you know it. The second edition of the book, he took the diagram out, but I still think it's useful. So you imagine that this rather regular egg is where we talk about things. And at one end you've got orthodoxy, and the other end you've got heterodoxy. If you look at the situation, perhaps you can be like it away from the mic. It's getting a bit if you imagine that this larger dotted egg is perhaps where we are now roughly, where orthodoxy is a sort of, it's the small end of things, and heterodoxy is up here, then what becomes interesting is what's just outside. And it's looking to the not yet quite concrete, I think, that's useful. And you can actually plot things. I find it a very useful tool. This is the orthodox view, this is the extreme heterodox or unorthodox view, and what's just over here. And certainly in the UK, as we move towards an entirely capitalist state, we're beginning to see right out into the realm of the undisputed, the stuff we don't talk about because we assume everybody agrees with it. Another issue, I think, in most housing situations. I was introduced to Donald Schoen's work back in the mid-80s, partially because, or mostly because Roger Simmons, who was one of my colleagues at Joint Centre for Urban Design, had been a PhD student, which had actually done field work on, I call it that, on the architect's studio. And I very much like these quotes, and I use them all the time. So in the varied topography of professional practice, there's a high, hard ground overlooking a swamp. On the high ground, manageable problems lend themselves to resolution through the application of research-based theory and technique. In the swampy lowland, messy, confusing problems defy technical solution. And Schoen says the irony of this situation is that the problems of the high ground tend to be relatively unimportant to individuals or society at large, however great their technical interest may be, while in the swamp lie the problems and the opportunities of greatest human concern. And I think, if you're going to be involved in housing, you need to get down there in the swamp. It's no good doing these things. So, let us choose, says Schoen. Are we going to occupy the high ground? Or are we going to descend into the swamp with important problems? And he says not rigorous inquiry, but I don't think it's not rigorous. I just think it's different methodologies. And that leads me to the other thing, which I think, the notion's been around a long time, and it's dead easy to talk about. It's very difficult to do in an organised manner. So reflection in actions has a critical function, questioning the assumptional structure of knowing in action. I very much like that phrase. We make a lot of assumptions when we make professional decisions, and we quite often don't reflect on why those assumptions might be slightly wrong or even significantly wrong. We think critically about thinking that got us into this fix or this opportunity. Again, I think that's easy to say, sometimes difficult to do. And we may in the process restructure strategies of action, understandings of phenomena or ways of framing problems. But he then says all of this is viable to the squeeze play. Now, my daughter did some research recently. She's a project manager, and for her master's she did some research on how cutting-edge approaches to project management related to everyday practice. And she found a whole series of research papers. You would be surprised. It's interesting to look up project management research and Google it, because they've got a great body of work going on. And the change in project management is that they're becoming much more concerned with emotional intelligence. They're becoming much more concerned with working in long-term teams across institutions. And they understand the need for reflective practice to build the capacity in a commercial world to build the capacity. The problem with the commercial world is that senior project managers, when they've got 4/5 through a project, are moving to dealing with the next project. So they don't actually have time to embed the learning in action, the knowing in action of their team. So again, easy to say, difficult to manage. Michael Erard talks across disciplines like Schoen, makes another very important point, I think, that professional knowledge can't be characterised in a manner that's independent of how it's learned. I don't think you can learn anything without contextualising it. There is thought in abstract, but I don't think it's very useful. And it's through looking at the contents of acquisition of knowledge that its essential nature is revealed, and the problems, and the possibly mistaken notions. This is where it becomes slightly painful to those of us that have spent a lifetime on research, but I think it's very important. Ron Barnett wrote a series of books about universities around millennia, and he says phrases comes to rival research, or to be more accurate, there comes to be no sharp distinction between the two activities. And again, he uses two phrases that I like. He says, knowing in the world, practice, not only comes to be accepted as a valid form of knowledge, but the distinction between it and knowledge of the world, research, is often impossible to determine. Whilst I'm here, I've done terrible things to, well, it doesn't matter whether I've done terrible things to me, but this is the man who, Raul Flores, who in Lima, was the person who made sure that the program I mentioned later worked for over 6 years, and I owe him a great deal. One of the things I've noticed in the last 10 years is that there aren't really any more brass plates, certainly not in international practice. Everyone's an urban designer or a houser if they're involved in the general field. If you look at the biggest companies involved in these sorts of activities, they've swallowed up one after another in an accelerated format in the last 10 years. So, you know, if you go to somebody in England like Savills, who used to be estate agents, they now do everything. Everything from design to construction to management. And they're the biggest. If you take the American firm OIKONET, I think they have 30,000 employees worldwide. I think that's right. And so we have to come to terms with that. We have to know where we are. Probably the spot is the healthiest place to be, because most big practices don't go there. And obviously, there's always the problem. And one of the things, if people ask me what I am, I usually try to say that because I don't like the things that go sometimes to architecture, and houser sounds a bit pretentious and indistinct. But you have to understand as an urban designer how you can manipulate public good into corporate returns. Understanding, that means understanding finances as well as not as well as the experts, but being able to talk about them critically. And then crossing boundaries and sharing knowledge, which is the key, I think, to how we should go forward. I owe this slide to a former colleague of mine, Stuart Parker, and we were actually doing a workshop like this in Ecuador. You know, this is the sort of model in my innocence that I grew up with when I was first in university. You know, here's the market, here's the community, here's the state, and here's civil society. It didn't exist then, but it was a sort of broadly useful picture. And now this is too much a simplified version of what we're doing. The state, in most places, is fragmented into lots of different parts. The market, you can't quite tell where the market begins and other things end. And civil society has fragmented enormously. And I mean, again, in the UK, I'm going to say bad things about the UK, but at the moment the UK is trying to put itself back like this. And it likes the communities being very small like that, because then it exerts enormous power, but it calls it localism. It's not. One other thing that comes up now all the time, every conference you go to, people say cities are vastly important because more than 50% of the world's population. You know the story. But I think what we don't really tackle quite enough is how to reform cities for all. Again, it's a vast problem, but I think it's a problem for people in particular who are interested and engaged in housing. In many places, regional configurations no longer have the power that they used to because the city has become all. But I believe firmly in regional configurations because you can balance things between cities and smaller towns, and you can consider how to avoid those things that happen when people compete unnecessarily with another city down the road. And then the whole business of, it seems to me, the lessening of the importance of rural society and how the places in this sort of model, you know, between the fingers, this is the urban stuff, and this is the rural stuff. And one of the big things at Greenwich that my colleagues got involved in was how the country faced the city and the relationship between food and the city. And that's probably all I want to say about that. So, to finish this section, I want to just, we used to have an organisation in the UK called UDAL, the Urban Design Alliance, and it brought together all the professional groups that were involved in making places. And sadly, it's no longer exists, but I had a conference in Greenwich just over 10 years ago. I was asked to make a response to a keynote from the president of the World Institute of British Architects, and I said nice things, and he's a great guy. He's actually now mayor of Bristol, which terrific thing. So. But I used this as an opportunity to make a slightly sly response to a thing that the Prince of Wales had produced, which was called the 10 Commandments of Architecture. And I called mine the 10 deadly skills and behaviours. And this is really the sort of thing that I think you have to get, I thought you have to get, and I'd like to debate this if we can later, that you have to ask students to think about. One is to be skillful. It might sound obvious, but I think being able to communicate those skills and being able to understand across the board locational analysis, cost benefits, public-private, robust building forms is a critical thing. And in many places, students aren't able to do that or aren't even in a mindset to do that when they graduate. Reflect on their learning experience, well obviously that's part of the shared agenda. But I found, and I don't know what you find, that the team working is no longer the problem. Good teams have different people with different skills. But in the modern world we tend to work in groups, and that is that we'll work in a group that has people from all sorts of different organisations pushing forward with the project from different backgrounds, with different buttons to press in terms of their career, in terms of the efficiency of their organisation. So being able to work with groups is something that I've spent quite a lot of time developing with groups of students of mixed discipline. Avoid superficiality. My unfair example here is the notion of streets in the air, which is very popular in parts of Europe, particularly the UK and in the Netherlands. Streets in the air are nothing like streets in the ground. There's absolutely no similarity whatsoever. So we mustn't transfer half-understood forms to inappropriate places. And demonstrating knowledge of physical precedent. I mean, most of us just make small changes to huge cities, and huge cities have been built over time. If you don't understand morphology and typology, then you're not going to demonstrate expertise. For architects in particular and urban designers, subjugate ego, be on tap, not on top. I think we should regard city development as a slow process, and city renovations and rehabilitations as a slow process. Things have to last a long time unless you're in Las Vegas. And then the key for me, this is argue, develop and negotiate rationales, and the rationale I'll show a rather simple one later. It's instead of saying this is what I'm going to do, I can't think I've kept a cartoon in here. Explain what you're going to do, explain why you're doing it, explain how you're going to achieve it, when and where, and illustrate all of those things so that you cut out that thing which a lot of cartoonists in England have particularly in the Architect's Journal, where the client is thinking about a rose-trimmed cottage and the architect's thinking about the little sapphire. And so the problem at the end is that the client who wanted a thatched cottage with roses gets a concrete, modernist building. And then seek out the widest range of stakeholder participants, and I can see from the papers that we're going to hear later, that's something that underpins this project. And finally, understand and explain the movement economy. I know some people here who are user-based syntax. A lot of architects somehow don't like it. It's idiotic. Okay, I've had nothing to do with Prenzlauer Berg, apart from me visiting it in the 1980s before the wall came down. And I had very good contacts with people in the East there. And I was struck in 1987, I think it was, with the fact that in East Berlin there were some small improvements going on in the infrastructure, and particularly in streets in Prenzlauer Berg. And the other thing that was happening was that the socialist government was allowing very small pieces of private enterprise. And in fact, I had a very large party of students from the UK, but from all over the world, who came with me. And they bumped into a group of students that they met at a conference who'd been given permission to renovate a building and start a bar in it. But there's a lot of myth that goes around the whole issue of what went on in the East before it became the West. And I went back to Prenzlauer Berg just a few months ago, and I was struck with the fact that it's very don't know whether you can read, you probably can't see the reference I've given at the bottom. I just urge you, I think Prenzlauberg is a sort of model for what's going on in older districts that are being renovated now, because the issues of tenure come up, and people always say, oh, the Germans have got protection, but it's not working properly in Prenzlauberg. And it's becoming gentrified, and Berlin itself is becoming like so many global cities. There's more to do with people across the globe than people within it. And so I'd recommend to you Andrew Willows' 2006 paper, Urban Renewal and the End of Social Housing, the role of neoliberalism in East Berlin's Prenzlauberg, which is in social justice. Well, it says it in the stream. I'm sorry, the screen doesn't show it. So I think there are issues that come up, particularly in major places close to the centres of major cities, that are really probably only at the forefront of what we're going to see in the future. And this is a typical Berlin Hobrecht block. It wasn't in Prenzlauberg, it was in the middle of Berlin. And I've talked about Noel's house. This was, I think, Tilly's version in the little dacha. And you can't probably, you can catch. But this is somebody who probably lived in a rather down tenement. And these little huts, there's small but large. Okay, I mean, challenging prevailing norms is always difficult. And this in the 1980s was the primary form of English housing beyond the declining public sector. And what you see here is major highways with very few connections and housing areas that are like the tips of trees, way away, monolithic. See here, large proportion of these houses are detached. There are some terraces, and there are some quite odd, not quite back-to-back, but small flats that had two open sides and then two opposite party walls. And at that time, one of our missions at the Joint Centre for Urban Design was to try to combat this and to get back to places where different things could happen, and effectively streets. And so we entered with a developer the design building competition in Reading. And this is a very long time ago. The competition was 1984, and we won it in 1985. And it was published because we were trying, as this says here, to get back to the street. I don't like the back-to-back, that's a piece of journalism, but that's another subject. And even in towards the centre of cities, private developers were detached, preferably detached houses. And this is the rationale that we used, and it's not a very good quality slide because it was a very quickly produced rationale to explain why we thought what we were proposing to do was a good idea. So, looking at surveillance and safety in fronts and backs, looking at traditional streets, they weren't quite traditional, but they were trying to looking at safety, looking at links, which seem to us to be very important because this is very close to the centre of Reading, and we could make links. Looking at the issue of capitalising on the water side, actually saying what the mix of housing might be, and then in a slightly post-modern fashion, saying that these are the examples that define the domestic and waterside architecture, and this is the way we're going to interpret it, and looking at some mixed use. And when we made our presentation, we used this as the base, and then we produced a series of photographs from the place to show how it benefit. And the runner-up was this, which didn't have any real street structure, and that's what ours looked like. And it was bought by the city who had to give permission. And the other thing about it is that also at that time, no developer would do joined up housing. So this is, you've got flats, there's a flats, that's a house, that's a little house, that's a And of course, the only way we could persuade the developer to join them up is by saying, look, if you do that, you get a much higher density. The city will buy it with high density. You'll make more money. And yes, it's a bit complicated for you, but think about it. But at the same time, it actually does something which cities, even in England, have always done. And it's not perfect, but it was picked up by the international press, and I believe it had some significant effect within the UK. These pictures are horrible, taken just afterwards, but you can see what we were trying to do in the terrace streets. I can't really see clearly here. We were making a whole idea of the colours of the brick was simply to blend in with the colours. This is quite an old building, 18th century building. At the early one on the site got warehouses. So trying to do something, and a large part of this development was bought by housing associations which are that third arm of development. Now, I'm just going to talk very briefly about this. The Prince of Wales, the foundation for the built environment, which is called something else now, in the early 90s, had tried to work with the community in Lancashire to stop the local authority demolishing the whole community. And the particular, what I must say is the particular point here is that part of that community, the smaller part, were in privately rented housing. And the rest of the people there are what I would call marginal homeowners, in that within the last 15 years or so, they have bought a house with 3 bedrooms for £1,000. That's what's that? Whatever the euro rate is, it's more than €1,000. I bought my first house in 1973, I think it was, for £1,000. I didn't recall a very prime area. But this is, we're talking 30 years later. Nowhere else could you do that. If the local authority had done what they wanted to do, demolish the lot, scarcely a single one of the community could have afforded to have stayed with what was built later. And there was such a shortage of social or low-cost private sector housing in the area that many of them would be made homeless, but the local authority wanted to go ahead. It's in Nelson, it's in the cotton producing area of Lancashire. This is the particular study area, this is the stuff that's made demolished, and this is the old mill where we worked. And interesting community because there was an influx of people from Bangladesh and India after the Second World War, and so the communities had grown up together. And so although there were tensions, the tensions in the community weren't racial, they were mostly tensions between the older groups and the young groups. And you get an idea of what it's like. It's a typical street, quite a good street. This is the mill, beautiful canal links into the production and movement of cotton now. This is the typical back alley of these terrace houses, which are in many respects typical of stuff all of brick, but particularly north of Coventry area. And quite a mixed area. Some improvements going on at risk in the area. And I don't hold a particular flag for the Prince of Wales, but the organisation, we were there for the better part of 7 days, and we worked from about 8:30 in the morning until about 2 o'clock in the morning, and we had a base in the local community centre. And the basic methodology was getting as many people involved as possible, putting up notices, using local community organisers, and trying to set an agenda for what we want to try and do within it. Then having lots and lots of joint visits around the place to discuss everything that was of concern to anybody in the community and pick up on things that we could see were technical issues. Then have major meetings, but also all-day open sessions where people could come and contribute during the time. And these slides are from the interim part of the project. And here is a typical group. This is one of the leaders of the community. This is a constantly with, well, is it like this, is it like that? One of the key things, I think, was that we had an absolutely brilliant traffic planner urban engineer who did a whole series of not space syntax analyses, but hand analyses, looking at how minor changes to the roads could actually, what would I call it, to actually enable some parts of this development which had streets and shops to regain those streets and shops because they were better connected. And in the stuff about looking at the hierarchy of the certain landscape and so on and so forth. And the part of the government initiative which was pushing the local authority to demolish was about improving the mix of dwellings in places. And we did a series of studies to show that, for instance, where the local community were using two houses together and actually knocking through, it produced a much bigger dwelling just by very simple intervention. And if you were going to go for a rolling renewal program, you could take the same basic block form and you could insert modern units and put flats on corners and do without destroying the fabric of the place and the community, and doing it in such a way, on the old Dutch model, that you could have a rolling renewal program where you could decant people into recently improved dwellings and so on. I put this in because it irritates me. We had one group of very nice architects with us, and they took the model of the knock-through house, but the Asian community really wanted the old kitchens here because they were very highly ventilated, and they would have two kitchens quite often in the existing wing on the back, but the architect didn't like that, so he took it out at the time, and that's the sort of thing I mean about architects and sort of the rest of the people base. And throughout this project, we had a very capable artist who would produce these renderings overnight to discuss with the locals how that might be. Now, the proving projects, were funded by a collaboration with the Faculty of Architecture and Urbanisms and the Arts at the Engineering University in Peru. And we had one, and then we weren't allowed in those days to renew it. So after a year's pause, we had another. And they were meant to just facilitate staff exchange and curriculum development. But what Michel Deserto calls the Peru funding ways of using little bits to do other things based on old practices. Is what we did to enable a series of workshops, which were for me the most marvellous things, where we had usually 10 to 15 students from Oxford, from landscape architecture, planning, a couple of others sometimes, working with the students from the University of England. And they would produce a SWOT analysis, and they would produce an initial design framework, and then the students in the would continue with the design. I didn't let the students in England continue with the design and borrow the people making design decisions away from the place. But what they did was to do a great deal of research about things that would help, that came out of the issues in the workshop, and then all of that was go back and went into their library. So for those of you that don't know, some people do. And this was one of the workshops in Miraflores, which was a sort of resort area of the city. And this is just some examples. I mean, the reports were very extensive. Some of it was an overview of some of the things they were doing. So the students would always do what was very simple space syntax analyses. This is the part of the city. This is the Pacific Coast. And this is architecture, but in a way that was to suggest different things that might be possible. And there's the group, and this group's work. Many of them are now quite senior private and/or sector practitioners. This is an overview of the area here. And the area is a between the more salubrious parts of Lima and an area which is a banking area, and an area with rather high class housing. And the agendas came from the local authority, and the local authority wanted to try and improve the space between. Very long down. And sort of just very poor stuff. This is the Costa Verde in Lima, which is no longer Verde. Very big problem with water. And so you can see the floor is here, here. We did projects all around here and to higher. So we take inspiration maps, quantitative maps. Again, examples of students' work using the information from the movement analysis. And this is actually a rather good street in that part of the city. And I didn't say that facetiously because it's actually narrow and I couldn't find the right pictures. But the street we're standing on is absolutely enormous. And one of the outcomes of the project, there was a whole massive work done on highway alternatives. And one of the outcomes was that Lima's made up of, I think it's 34 municipalities, it may not be, it's something with low relatives. And the municipality changed their highway ordinances from US-based ordinances to ordinances that came out of this workshop. And the city planner who took me when I went back and said, look, I want to show you this, and it actually said at the bottom that it was as a result of the workshop, further work between Oxford and England. And people did things more conventionally, not hindsight services, but looking at what you could do in a context with rented shacks over time to develop conventional stuff. But this is an example of something that was entirely unanticipated. We'd seen one or two places like this, holes in the wall, and we asked about them and looked on the maps and plans. And we were given an entrance to this via the milk lady. That's the woman that provided milk for young mothers. And it is a piece of housing that was constructed by the British Railway Workers Temporary Accommodation about the turn of the 19th, 20th century. Subsequently invaded and occupied. There were about 32 families and over 100 people in this space, and there's a common kitchen at the end and some sinks at the beginning. And most of the cells were just had a door, no other ventilation. Some on this side over the window as well. Pretty dark. So a lovely community. And so this is our lot, talking to people in the community. Went away and did some analysis, looked at opportunities and alternatives. The key thing being to try and house the same group of people on the same site. Quite a lot of work was done on that, and then discussions with the municipality and with their architects are actually very interested and have been working out some ideas themselves. So there's a very nice dialogue. And the guy that I showed you, Raul Flores, who I squashed, he was dean of the faculty for a period, but at the time this was going on, he was also vice minister for housing in Peru. And so we tackled him and said, come on, there must be something you can do. He said, well, okay, we'll have a look at it. And whilst we were there, they established that none of the people had a fancy job, they were all informed. And that made it very difficult. And then he said, he's actually got finance, economics qualification, so I'll look at it from the point of view of what we actually do, and so we do that. And essentially, there was then a transfer of land and a mortgage, which I suspect will never be paid, it's a state mortgage. And it may not look great, but it's clean, ventilated, decent accommodation. And following year, the community who wanted to show what they've been able to do as a result of the workshop. This is a project that came out of the Peru project through the private sector. We were asked to help with the regeneration of 2.5 kilometres of water. Part of Guayaquil, like any other Latin American city and American cities that invest the money, it seems to me that this is a consolidation mechanism isn't so bad, and if you can get money to put in water supplies, drainage and road finish up in highways development. The first time I went there, it was described as unglamorous, squalor solution. It was very severely funny when I got there. This is the waterfront. This used to be a Malacon. In the beginning of the 19th century, it was a wooded work on the water side. And this is what Guayaquil would look like, because the Guayas River, the point about the Malacon was that it all become eroded, and the Guayas River, which is a great beast of a thing, would come in when it wanted and flood the city and do enormous damage and encourage disease. This was supposedly by Bratislava, as it turned out not to be. It was the smelliest fish market I've ever been there. There's always a problem with working in Latin America that you're never quite sure who you're working with, and the mayor certainly didn't waste time on the niceties. But the mayor that redeveloped this redeveloped a very good location about half a kilometre away. And this is him, ex-president of Ecuador and mayor of the city whilst the project was being developed. This is how it was developed. We set up, they set up the Fundación Corbusier, and we were the Oxford Brooks expatriate team, that just three of us, that we brought in other experts which we needed to. And the principal person was Stuart Parker, who was the manager. And then we had, because of the problems of starting projects and not finishing them, because of the problems of probity, they wanted to have the technical team employed by Oxford Brooks, which somehow or other one of my colleagues persuaded Brooks to do. And part of particularly Stuart's job was to produce monthly monitoring reports, so we had to constantly give advice on issues to do with the management of the project. I think the greatest thing to say about the project was that all the work was done by colleagues in Guayaquil, and all the materials and all the money came from within the country that had to fold its currency while the work was taken. The Americans allowed them to take the dollar as a currency. As you can see here, this is part of the drug events to worry about the quality of the site. And here's the market converted into a flashy conference centre and exhibition area. It did a lot to the bottom end of the this is giving back another concept to people, and Guayaquil is one of those places where when you go to work it pours with rain, and it's beautifully sunny, and when you come back to work it pours with rain. So the whole city is arcaded in that this powerful groups like the yacht clubs and boat clubs wouldn't move or have anything to do with it other than gaining benefits on the other side, so they have to take the boardwalk around them so that they didn't interfere with them. I mean the architecture, I was effectively a design consultant, but the architecture, much of it I really don't have much appetite for. But this thing is the commercial centre, and since the completion of the project, it's actually kept the project going entirely self-funded, so the rents for the commercial centre provide all the maintenance costs and so on. There you can see one of the its text. The banks were keen to get rid of their vastly expensive collections of artifacts, and so they put buildings here and other performance spaces. And this is the one thing that they couldn't produce in Ecuador, which had to be imported in Europe as screens for performance spaces. And one thing that certainly happened was that people who used to live in these gated communities with really long and tedious drives back into the city started to move into newly regenerated housing. I wouldn't make too much of an issue of it, but there was definitely an upper middle class influx, trickle, compared with very few people wanting to live in the city. I'm going to go fast because I don't want to lose your timetable. Another mayor takes over, fortunately, same political side, but even so, unlike many South American mayors, he didn't say, oh, that was a load of rubbish, I had nothing to do with it. He thought, here's an opportunity for me to make more of it. And so there was a second phase to take the development back into the city, and we had a workshop there with people from the Catholic University and another college. These were the English, that must be very English. And we did a SWOT analysis with people from the city, mostly from the public sector, to see what they thought about it, and the students did typical UN body, good governance, and also produced things like heritage maps and so on. And the mayor took the development back into the city. So, having done this, he then did that, and some of the funding for that did come from international sources, including all the infrastructure, putting in a Curitiba type soft-wheeled trolley bus tram, so that students who were at Free University and no longer had to come on their very dirty smoke cars up there could go by bus, and then maybe Maricon at the other end. But this, like the place in Lima, the Solaris with the 32, 34 panels in it, was the next issue, I guess. And this is Santana Hill, which was the oldest squatter settlement in Kiel, and also originally had been the sort of lookout fortress of the city. And this was a view from the bank where we sat in large conclaves. And we could see the mayor thinking, well, maybe I just need to pull this down. That's why these students go up the hill. An armed guard, because the local economy there, the police wouldn't go in there. The local economy was come down the mountain and hold people up at dusk, buy crack and heroin, and go back up the mountain and get stoned. I mean, quite literally, the police, they've had several attempts to have the police force on that list. Pretty awful. And all we did was to talk. And we asked who else that, and it was unclear, but the city had the ultimate tenure. And we asked who else was involved, and it was the church. And we said, well, somebody's placing this, they need rebuilding, but someone don't. And really that was our contribution. It was very little more than that, although the students did do projects that showed that we can do things like this. The mayor, bless him, numbered all the steps, so the tourists were going to come out and told them when you go up the next number of steps, and then you have to look out at the top. And a lot of the improvements were superficial, just new tin roofs and coat of paint, but some of them were, as you can see from the earlier photograph, absolutely substantial, and the route was made open and clear. And it's again, it's a slightly trite thing to say, but essentially the roads went from robbing anybody down the bottom to the gradual influx of tourists buying trinkets and drinks on their way up to the lookout on top of the hill. So I just make this point, and I think other people may make it, that given the right arguments, people will surprise you with what they can do, even when they're the absolute capitalists. Very, very interesting. I worry almost every day that what Zygmunt Bauman says, that without a touch together, separation and keeping a distance becomes the most common strategy these days in the struggle for survival. And I know I shouldn't refer to it, but people walking around cities with things in their lives and don't have the oral contact as powerful contact as well as the, they don't really look at you. And it's going to, I believe, cause tremendous problems, because if we lessen the impact of normal human exchange, then we'll cease to need it. And I think it's happening. Every supermarket in England now has mostly automatic checkouts. There's no exchange. And Bauman goes on to say the continuum along which the results of the struggle are plotted stretches between the poles of voluntary and involuntary guess. So this is diagram, this is on one of the estuaries. And here you've got the issue that virtually all cities across the world are starting to display spaces and zones that are powerfully connected to other valued spaces across the urban landscape, as well as across national, international, and even global distances. At the same time, though, there's often a palpable and increasing sense of local disconnection in such places from physically close, but socially and economically distant places and people. And London has to be just about one of the worst recent examples. I mean, they're shipping people out of London. It's like a apartheid. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions. Maybe if you could expand a little bit on the positions in the formats and the
Sorry, driving to Canada, it's all
okay. No, just if you could expand on the differences between the informal settlements that you have visited in North America in terms of the generation as compared to some of the European ones which are essentially formal.
I don't think there's any comparison. I mean, the danger is that in the 1980s, there were a lot of groups that went out from the UK and did readouts and jetted in and spent a week there and came back. We used to have a lot of them come into the Royal Centre and make presentations, and they made me physically angry because I thought it was cheap flying into places and flying out. And I promised myself that I would never do anything without a strong local connection and without developing things over time. But when I worked in Lima on and off for 1996 until 2003, so it's 96 years. And I still wouldn't presume to really understand anything very much without being constantly tested with people in the place. And I mean, the only thing I would say is that sometimes, my Spanish when I was there for a long time got slightly better. I noticed that they weren't translating what I was saying, and they weren't all giving me the right answer. But once you knew people know about it, you said, well, can they tell me about it? I mean, I think the UK, a lot of it's under-counted now. I mean, it's not stuff. I spent about 7 years as chair of the development committee for the Developing Housing Association. And we did mostly new development, but we were also renewing housing that we had. And we had people who were in the field, people who worked, and we had a lot of very big accommodation. We had wardens and people who were responsible for each place and who could bring together a group of residents to discuss things. And I think a lot of that's getting lost. And housing associations, if we're not careful in the UK, are going to disappear and their assets to be taken in by central government, which is absolutely appalling. So I think tenure is at the bottom of many things. And I had a short visit to somebody I've not known as long as Kareem, but under some other circumstances, in Cape Town. And we had several people, one in particular, like if you're interested, I can find the reference. Because working in squatter settlements in South Africa, I think tends to be close to the most difficult of all, even legally, social agendas in South Africa. And there was one group, two young architects who were working with the community in Scotland settlement, and they were doing what they called reblocking. So they were taking small parts of the settlement, working with the residents there, and recreating better dwellings and better public spaces and better relationships. And what they couldn't do was to unlock tenure. So they couldn't give the people that they did this for the rights of tenure, even though they had to put sweat equity in and a small amount of So they came up with what I thought was a fantastic solution, which the government accepted. They gave them formal status as local government tenants. And so they had all the tenants' rights, and so they couldn't simply be moved on. And I think that tenure is at the bottom of the page that we have, and sometimes it's very difficult to say anybody can transfer ownership. But if you can find other mechanisms, like whether they can't, and I understand why not in South Africa, because otherwise everybody would immediately want tenure, and that would be impossible. And it would be impossible without improving conditions. But to make them local as a tenure seems to me to be an absolutely inspiring move. So I think tenure is at the bottom of it, and that's a problem across the world. But the conditions in countries other than Europe, it seems to me, so in any way powerful.
Thank you, Richard. Any other questions?
Thank you very much, Jim Roach from the Institute of Technology. I've worked on these kind of projects, and I've been on the receiving end. And so seems to be in this here with the mic, is it?
It's not very good.
Yeah, where Dublin City Council will bring over a group like yourself from London, I think Thompson's sort of name, from Camden, to do a project with the community. And there's great energy generated, and there's great results done, but my experience is that unless there's a continuity right through to the management of the place after work is done, it's almost a bit pointless. I'm partly playing devil's advocate here, but because there's a lot of at its worst it's a big charade by the local authority, and I've had experience where we were the architects for Dublin City Council on housing scheme, and it all went well. We can start.
No, you're much better.
I just raised my voice. That's great. And we did this housing scheme, and the residents were brought along to those occasional meetings. But at the end, when the residents came back to live there, it was a terrible disappointment, and a lot of anger towards us and the City Council. So that's my point really, that there has to be this continuum of engagement, and unless there is, it can often be disastrous.
Shall I do without my comment? I agree with you entirely, apart from when you said probably better not to do it. One thing that I won't do is I will only work with partners who are in place. Now, it nevertheless means that when the glamorous group goes off, and the energy filters away, sometimes things don't continue. But also, I've never actually done something that was, say, a major estate renewal in another country because of what you say. Because I think all that we tend to do is to act as catalysts to make changes that can lead to other changes. In Ecuador in particular, the political fluidity, if I can put it that way, and variability over time, means that you could only guarantee that the things that were achieved during the period in which you had a great engagement would benefit everybody. And I know very well that in most Latin American countries there are lobbies, including often the Catholic Church, that will try to look after poorer communities. But that if push comes to shove, and a local municipality is going to get a lot of money to do something else by doing something else, they'll do it. And they only might be moderated in what they do if you're there and on the case. When we were working in Guayaquil, one or other of us was there almost, certainly every month, and we were constantly in dialogue with what they were doing. But I I totally agree. What you have to do is to try and build the capacity and the will and the support for local people, because otherwise it's a waste of time. And these jetting in and out and coming up with ideas and then buggering off again, if you'll excuse my language, it's absolutely awful as the direction. So I think we're.
Thank you, Richard. One more question, maybe?
How do you instill that in students so that they are able to respond, and how do you educate for a changing world?
Well, I think you have to use diagrams like good old Corbusier egg, because I think you have to get people to reflect on what they think are things that are assumed in their everyday life. I have to confess that a lot of them don't find that diagram particularly useful. But one of the things that I've done, which I found the most useful, and it's slightly tangential to your question, but the University of San Diego, years and years and years ago, produced a box of tricks. And we had Graham Gibbs as our educational development person at Brooks, who's highly renowned in the UK. And they went on to do the same role in Oxford University, and he's now at the University of Winchester. And I discovered that one of the things is this business of working in groups or working in teams, and I got fed up with architects talking about working in teams. Especially if you put a bunch of architecture students together, they all want to do the same thing, they're all good at the same thing, and they just can't cut it. So I used to, there's two games that the San Diego box had in it. One's called Broken Squares, and one's called Hollow Squares. And Broken Squares is something that you do within a few minutes, and you sit people around the table, and they have to make a series of squares out of some bits of stuff, and they're all in an envelope. And it's amazing because it makes people realise that unless they cooperate and understand that it's a group effort, and they're quite different if you do it at the start of their education, they can't do it at all. Whereas the groups that do understand it get it done in 35 seconds. So I've had people take 35 minutes. And then, so that's a very simple one. And then the other one, the hollow squares, is much more elaborate. So you put a team to do this out in one, and a team to do that, and then the operating team sits in the central space. But it's also a very complicated jigsaw puzzle this time. And they're very rigid rules for these games. And what they don't understand is they can't give clues that they can actually have a facilitative relationship with some of the groups. And so on one occasion we had a guy from New York City, a lovely black guy who worked in the black neighbourhoods, and this was a community facilitator. And he got to the end of the project, and it was this game, and we were having the debrief, and he said, "Oh my God, I spent my life doing this, but I couldn't see it here." And I think that's a start. If you start to shake people's belief that their accepted practices and beliefs are not given, particularly not given anymore, and then start to look at, to discuss institutions, discuss place. I mean, I think, there's an open morphology conference on as we speak, I think, in Rome, with some of my colleagues there. Now, I'm not a morphologist, but on the other hand, if you look at some cities, not mostly in England, but if you look at cities that the English set up, like Melbourne is a classic example, it's the background of one of the slides. They were set out on a simple grid, but they then introduced a system for dividing those grid elements up. Fantastic system. So the whole place is understandable, and you know how big things can get and how small things can get. I think a lot of architects, even at the scale of buildings, so typology, architects don't learn typologies now, not even very rarely, and they certainly don't learn morphology. I mean, the morphology of the city lives for thousands of years, and we're only making small changes. And if you don't make the right small changes, you mess up the system. Now, it's not to say that cities have to be ossified, but you have to understand what it is you're doing. You're not going to sweep them away unless you're in China. And there was a slide, one of my first slides showed a piece of China where we did the workshop, and I had to cut it out, because as you see I was pressed to get through what was left. And we had a really interesting project there, because it's a vast area, I can't remember how many hectares, huge, And the Chinese, the government, the socialist government had sent us a plan with Corbusier slat blocks right across this vast area, but saying, we're interested in something different. And the group were welcomed by, we worked with 2 universities, the group were welcomed by the Communist Party. By the time we left, they forgot us, they didn't want to know us. Because the Chinese students from 2 universities and our students were at one about wanting to protect the natural environment, wanting to maintain considerably not first-rank historic buildings, but third-rank historic buildings, and to maintain some epidemic because of the issue of character movements. Tianjin was just a nasty road from that explosion, but whilst I was there, the centre of Tianjin was being demolished. So it seems to be there aren't many places where you do that, and even there, get the right people together, and you can make tiny change, but it's all tiny, isn't it? I feel as if I spent my life achieving that much. In actual practice, I mean,